Hajime! Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. This is the War Room. I'm General Lance, your host, and today here with me, talking about the situation in the Ukraine, situations we're dealing with the CIA and frontmen, is our Celtic War Chief. How are you doing, brother?
Good. How are you doing?
Good. I'm happy to have you on, man. We go back a way long time. Do you mind just giving the audience some background as far as who you are and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, sure. I'm just a American Celt. My ancestry goes back to the founding stock of this country and this nation. And so, I've got that Celtic and Anglo sort of mix, just atypical of the Northeast, if you will, of the United States. And I just have a vested interest in this country's future and my people. And, that's why I get into these topics and try to give a contrarian analysis so that we're not captivated by propaganda and things like that can lead us astray. You know what I'm saying, brother?
Yeah, absolutely, man. And that's part of the deal with Lance's Legion. Obviously, it's not necessarily to be contrarian, but to be right. And I think that the issue with war, I'm sure you've seen all this stuff with the Ukraine-Russian war, and I think we linked up on this Peter Zeihan, Joe Rogan podcast thing. It's just so obvious. I guess it's obfuscation of the truth, but it's propaganda, right? And so, you see it from both sides. You see it from, obviously, the Russian side, who make up a faction of the PRC and Iran. But also you see it from the United States and NATO. You see it, in the Ukrainian propaganda. You see it with, liberals and the BBC, etc. But it's always very interesting. I mean, I'm sure you're aware of that CIA op called Operation Mockingbird and how people are able to, propagate an idea. So people don't really understand how do you say, practically that happens. Well, this is how it happens. Basically, the CIA, Central Intelligence, what they do is they form an asset, right? That asset isn't necessarily a CIA agent. What they do is they get their phalluses hard every time a government op comes up to them, and basically it's usually kind of a certain demographic, usually the people within a homosexual or something, which in this case it is. So Peter Zeihan is an individual who has a degree from a very out of the way place from Northeast Missouri State University. And then basically he got his postgraduate study from another no-name university. But he has been propagated as the, I don't know if you guys have seen it personally on Spotify or if you see it on YouTube, but it's you speak to this guy about this guy, and he's on the tip of everyone's tongue, referencing him as far as the incisive geopolitical insight into what's happening in rest of Ukraine. Right, and so I was like, oh my God. And so we watched it together, this episode with Joe Rogan. And so I felt like it was very important that we kind of balance out this obvious view that has a biased view. So I figured I would invite you on because you're an expert of many sorts, and I feel like you're way more qualified than this guy. But without further ado, I mean, what do you think overall of that interview? What was your vibe?
So the vibe is he kind of was tailoring his message as he went, and it seemed like they talked about basically 4 topics. They talked about Russia, they talked about China, they then talked about the U.S., Mexico, and they kind of had a tangent about environmentalism and EV technologies or alternative green energy type crap. But if you watch within each of those topics, you know, he gave, you know, with Russia, it was heavily, I would say it was very biased. Okay. There were some things I would agree with him on, but a lot of it was just very meme, like just regurgitating kind of memes and not giving, there's just too much nuance going on with Ukraine and Russia that you're really going to miss the mark if you just take the generalizations he was making. China, he got like a little bit more specific, you know, a little bit more like not necessarily balanced. I still think he was missing the mark. But, and then with America and Mexico, again, he said a lot of things that were true, but, you know, so I noticed that, that they talked about Russia first, and they kind of went through it so quickly, and that's where I saw where a lot of the propaganda kind of was like, messaging was being made, which makes sense because that's what the active war zone right now is. And as you know, 5th generation warfare, I have to smother every node of influence, whether it be a podcast like Joe Rogan, or, you know, the Twitter sphere, or some other sphere of media, including legacy media on Fox News or CNN. I have to make sure all these nodes are smothered with propaganda because I have forces, in this case proxy forces via Ukraine, engaged in an actual combat, right? So that's kind of like the meat and potatoes of kind of what I saw, in the vibe I was getting from him was just that, you know, either A, he knows better and he's doing his job as an asset, just as you described, you know, where he may not have gotten like direct what's the word I'm looking for? Directives from like a CIA person, but they know that this guy is just in his own mindset is going to give the narrative that they want. You know what I mean? So that's why, like you said, with Operation Mockingbird, it's not necessarily this man is on the payroll of the CIA and he's an actual agent. It's more like we're putting in place people that have, through their career, eaten up the, you know, drank the Kool-Aid and eaten up the propaganda that we've given, and so they're just regurgitating on their own our narrative, right? And then, you know, that way that person builds his career on a bias, right? And he's not going to backtrack his bias, right? That's when you know people are honest, is when you see them backtrack, when you see them say, hey, I got this wrong. You never really see that from people like this, you know? So right. That's the vibe I was getting, was, okay, he's heavily propagandizing the Russia, and then the other 3 topics were a little bit less, but there still was, you know? And it makes sense because we're in a current, actual war and 5th gen war with Russia right now.
Of course. And, you know, it's interesting that you say that because, I mean, I guess the thing that we're trying to go for here is we're just going to review the things that, this individual said, but there are too many lies to parse. But actually, it's not even a lie, because what it really is there's a saying, it's not a lie that's most harmful, it's truth deployed with insidious intent. And so, like, nothing necessarily he said was by itself factually, like, incorrect. It was the way that he strung them together and orchestrated these facts that completely missed the mark as far as, like, their significance. It's like cherry picking, for instance, right? That's all it is. And so we're just gonna, for this war room, because, like, I don't want to spend too much time, let's just focus on the most salient things. And I wanted you to pick your perspective about, like, the most jarring things he said about Russia that were either untrue or, like, needed context. And I kind of wanted to ask you questions about that. On a later time, we'll talk about Mexico and the renewable energy crisis, obviously, but I think we should focus on one thing and then another. What do you think?
Yeah, I think so too, because it's insane how in the first 15 minutes, almost every sentence he uttered, like, we have to unpack, you know? So, yeah, we can take our time, and I think a lot of people are very interested in what's going on in Russia, so it's important that we attack that first, because as I said, in those 4 topics that he talked about, Russia was the one that was heavily propagandized, right? So, you know, we can spend time on that and unpacking it so that our audience and have a better understanding of what's really going on, because that's the most pertinent thing that's happening, right? So
no, of course. Well, anyway, let's just get started here. I have like a list of things that he started off with, and I think the most jarring thing that I remember is his analysis overall about not necessarily demographics, but actually, for instance, internal religion of the East, and it's like role and propaganda theme, and or whatever he calls it. And basically he says that like the patriarch Kirill like has framed this conflict between Russia, or the Russian aligned like faction, the CSTO, which is their equivalent of NATO, right, and to NATO, and basically pitted a theme which is, you know, we're fighting against literally people that are demonic, that are like pedophiles, that are homosexuals and stuff like that. And he kind of scoffs it off, but I'm like, well, like, I mean, who is Epstein? Like, who, like, bro, like, you I mean, you yourself are that, like, I mean, bro, you know. So
yeah,
I think people wouldn't pick up on that if you didn't like Google his background like I did. And basically this guy is exactly what Patriarch Kirill is you know, indicting the West of being, you know what I mean? And so I wanted your perspective on it and see what you had to say about it.
yeah. So first off, what Zeihan said at that junction in the podcast, when they mentioned like what kind of propaganda either side is producing, and he said, you know, he said gay demons or something like that. I can't remember, but he was like, you know, that's what they're saying. That's what they're calling the NATO forces. That, you know, you're fighting against all these aspects that are degenerate, homosexuality, all these things. And it's funny because Zeihan like kind of communicated it as how ridiculous, you know, how low of them to have propaganda like that. I mean, you know, weak, right? And it's funny because if you look at World War I, you know, we literally called and had cartoons of the Germans as like literally like goblins and demons, and that were invading, you know, the Netherlands and Belgium, right? And that was propaganda that was used to motivate conscripts to go and fight in World War I, right? I mean, little cartoons of like a demon-looking, devil-looking German guy in a German outfit, and you know, the rape of Belgium, right? And we've used propaganda like that. All, you know, competing forces are gonna have. You got to keep constantly cultivating a narrative with propaganda. And you know, sometimes, you know, you might have propaganda that's tailored for the middle classes. So, for example, in Russia, they're now making the middle classes understand that this isn't a war with Ukraine. This isn't a war with the Ukrainian people. This is a war with NATO. This is a NATO war. And like all propaganda, there's half truth there, right? That if NATO didn't support and Europe didn't support Ukraine right now with weapons, with supplies, ammunition specifically, they would have been crumbling like pretty quickly, you know. So in a way, it is a war pretty much with NATO. This is a proxy NATO war right now with Russia. But then with the lower classes, you know, they're going to get more into the memes. They're going to get more into the mnemonic warfare, where these are gay demons, and they're probably taking pictures of all the gay pride parades we have here now. I mean, heck, a Russian propagandist right now probably has it so easy. He just goes on Google's USA Gay Pride or USA Trainee Story Hour, and he's got plenty of photos to make dozens of memes to infect the social media battle space, right?
Yeah, I don't even want to interject, but like, have you seen that article has been floating around of like a gay couple that's adopted children to pimp them out, like to their, you know, LGBT
circle, yes.
community, you know?
Yes, it's absolutely horrific. And again, that's fuel. That's, you know, we can get deeper into this because, you know, it's actually, it almost feels like we're just giving them ammunition nonstop. Not just for Russia, but for China, for all these countries. And you have to remember, like, whenever there's a battle like this, whenever there's you know, especially NATO or the US versus China or Russia or maybe even Iran in the future. The third world is watching, right? The third world is watching. They want to see like who really is the top dog, right? And if the third world is watching and they see Russians are fighting what they think is theirs, more nationalistic messaging, and they look at the West and we're waving gay flags and we don't like the family unit, and for example, we have gay people adopting these children, absolutely horrific things. Well, the third world has a much stronger reaction to that, and they're going to be, so you're winning over, these memes and this propaganda isn't just for your immediate audience. There's all these tailored aspects. That's why propaganda and psyops is actually now a very involved and heavily invested process. And it's not just for your local populace or your enemy's populace, but now you have the whole world watching. Everybody's got a cell phone now. Everybody's got the internet now, and you can win hearts and minds through all these different actions. So it's not surprising at all that the Russian propaganda, whether or not these propagandists themselves are degenerate and are doing gross things behind scenes, I'm sure it's safe to assume there's probably a whole load of oligarchy in Russia that are disgusting, right?
That's everywhere. That's everywhere.
Right, that's everywhere, and
yeah,
it's irregardless that what more propaganda do I have? Like, what more material is there floating out there? The majority of the material is the American degeneracy, and I can just scoop that up and get these big scoops of it and make just endless ammunition of memes, articles,
right. The irony.
On RT.
Yeah, the irony is that so before Ukraine got involved with Russia in the war, there were 0 gay pride marches in Kiev, for instance, right? And I think the funniest thing is that for whatever reason, as NATO became more entrenched in Ukraine, you see not only gay pride bullshit happening, but also George Floyd flags and Black Lives Matter flags, and it's dude, there aside from the African immigrants that were actually immigrating into Ukraine and emigrated out when the war happened.
Yes.
They're why do you have a sign that? Makes no sense. You know what I mean? And the thing is, though, is that one side institutionally pushes this stuff and the other side does it incidentally, and I feel I guess the point being is that one has a stronger case to be made. And let's not forget that the Russians are very powerful when it comes to human intel, but human psyops, right? A lot of liberal modern liberal takes come from the 1920s to 1960s communist Soviet psyops that took place in Hollywood, etc., and that ultimately changed the social fabric of the United States.
Yes.
Because and that's the funny thing, though, is that they're inheritors of that original psyop, and then basically, we're dealing with a country that's still very capable intelligence-wise and shaping narratives, etc. But I won't go into that detail too far. But I guess just moving on from that perspective, he talked about, for instance, population pyramids, right? Not just in China, but in Russia, and about how this would be the last year that the Russians would be able to levy a significant amount or number of men, fighting age males, capable of fighting with reserve training background to fight their wars. And I kind of wanted your perspective on it, and I have my own perspective after. But what do you think about that comment?
Yeah. So. Here's the thing about demographics. Here's some credit here's a good way to kind of segue. Why are people, we in the beginning, you mentioned how that people are, he is trending all over the place. I've never clicked on any of his videos, and they're trending all over my YouTube recommended. And which is funny because I'm always watching videos on geopolitical things, and I've never gotten him recommended before. I've been watching these kinds of things and watching channels and this topic. You would think that I would have gotten recommended. I would have had his recommendation on my YouTube feed way earlier, but it never did until recently. And that's even how I stumbled upon Joe Rogan's podcast. I saw lots of, I saw it trending on social media. And the reason why, part of why people, I feel, are gravitating to him is he is giving an analysis where, he talks a lot about geography and demographics. And, if you've been in the right-wing spaces, like, you would, to me, it's like a no-brainer that geography and demographics are like key to your analysis, and you should be shaping that as like part of your foundational piece. But you understand, like, the common people now, I mean, you see those videos where they go to, like, they have like a microphone and they go to like people on the street and say, "Hey, where's the United States located on this map?" They can't even like pick it, let alone Ukraine, let alone Iraq. And also, people have no idea the demographic declines that have been going on pretty much in every country except for the African nations.
I think the funniest thing that I saw, by the way, on that thing was someone was asking a question to this college student girl where Afghanistan is, and she literally pointed at West Virginia unironically, and I thought that was hilarious.
Because of the heroin, yeah. Oh, shit.
I mean,
That
hey,
is
it's a
ironic
similar
for sure.
shape,
Crap, dude. Like, well, I mean, mountains and heroin, right? Like, okay, that makes sense.
We got it.
Holy crap.
Anyway,
So,
go ahead. I don't want to interrupt.
like, so people are like, whoa, like, whoa, I've never heard of these things. Like, whoa, because it just shows you how debased our education has become in mass. That you have normies gravitating that, they probably even heard the term demographics before, And now, speaking, that's kind of been, that's kind of like the lure that I think is helping his promotion. Is that he is doing what you should be doing with bringing these attributes here. But I think the demographic part, that he kind of just so, like, in just such a crazy rhetoric, like, I've never heard before. Like, he said, I remember at one point he said they want to die on their own terms, because that's just absolutely going to happen between 2050 and 2070, simply because of the demographic situation that they have. What cracks me up is, and this is why, like, again, I wanted to focus on Russia, because, I mean, his rhetoric was way more extreme. He was pretty extreme with China too, but let's get something straight here that the audience needs to understand. Since the baby boom, each preceding generation, you have Gen X, Gen Y, now you have Gen Z coming in. All of these generations have gotten smaller and smaller, and we're not even anywhere near even just the baby boomer level, which, by the way, we call it the baby boom, but that was coming from a very low, which was the devastation of World War II, right? And the loss of life, the sheer amount of people that were wiped out with that war, right? So the demographic situation that Russia is facing, every nation is facing, okay, in the first world. Not so much in places like Southeast Asia, Africa, and some aspects of Latin America. But certainly in Europe, Russia, a lot of the developed Asian world, like China, Japan, the Koreas, the United States, we're all facing this demographic situation at the same time, which that really hasn't occurred in history. I mean, if we go back to the 100 Years' War in the Middle Ages, it kind of was the similar situation where you had, basically, when they're talking about demographics, they're basically saying, do you have a robust 20s or teens, 20s, and 30s versus your 40s, 50s, and 60s and elderly? It's basically, if I were to put it in simple terms, dividing your populace down the middle, where 40 and up are over here, and 35 and under are over here. And do you have more of these people than of the latter than the former? So every situation, every country is facing that, except for the United States, if you include the insane amount of immigration that we have. And now you start to understand why, for example, in 2022, we've had 200 to 250,000 people just coming across this border in droves. And everyone's scratching their head, even liberals, when you actually give them the data, they're scratching their heads like, how the heck are we sustaining any of this? And you start to realize that, it's because the populace that, you know, the host populace that built this nation, white Americans, we have just as much of a demographic problem that Russia has, that Europe has. You know, the only extreme examples would be Japan and China.
Right.
But,
And if I don't want to interject here, but I think to give some additional context, it's also not just about the way he portrays like demographics is almost as if it's just your age group, where what's the quality of that demographic group, right? So like,
Very
I mean,
true.
for instance, in the United States, there is a marked decline in IQ. Like, I think it was 1950s, the average IQ of the United States was like 105. And for those that don't know, like IQ is based on a scale where like 100 is the average, right? That was the original scope. And basically, right now, we're sitting at somewhere between 92 and 95. And now, like, yes, it is important to just have bodies, and math is its own quality. However, like, people don't understand, well, like, what is, I mean, I come from also like a family background that also has recent immigrants as well, right? And so like the thing is that people don't get is that you need a motivated populace that's capable and young. And the United States has an unmotivated or anti-motivated populace, including its host, you know, nucleus ethnic group, and then basically a steadily declining quality of you know, individual personnel, and then also a declining mass of that higher edge personnel. So what's ended up happening are the issues that we're finding now. And so the issue with Zeihan is that not necessarily that he's wrong about what's happening demographically in China or in Russia, but that he never flips the mirror and sees that the problem's actually worse domestically than it is abroad.
yes, he just kind of glosses. His rhetoric is so intense on their demographic problems. Even if he was to turn that mirror to us, it's automatically going to sound like a less severe situation, because he's like, oh, they're gonna die. They're gonna die, like crazy rhetoric like that. When even if he did flip that mirror and mention that, oh, by the way, you know, our situation domestically is such and such, automatically the viewer has been gaslit into thinking that Russia and China is way more severe, right? And again, that's where you absolutely need a counterbalance. So another note on the demographic situation is, just like you said, is if I'm going to have I have less people, right? Then I need to make sure that I got to put in plans now, so that when my population does reach to that lower level, I have a high functioning, high skilled, high productive populace that makes up for the dwindling in sheer number, right? And also, he never mentions. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. I don't want, just to add to that point. Remember, it was Putin that used the migrant masses from Syria, due to the civil war and instability like that, and Africa, and aimed them at Europe, right? So if migrants and diversity is so good, then why is that like crime and basically social decline and like social contiguity has fallen down? Is because of the fact that Putin realizes how much actually overwhelming migration can be used as a weapon. And it's funny because I read NATO sources like, you know, the Naval War College, etc., and it talks about Putin's weaponization of immigration. I'm like, well, aren't you the faction that pushes this idea that diversity is good and that unlimited immigration is good? So like, how are you able to, you know, call the pot and the kettle black when you yourself are, you know, you're saying two things at once, a catch-22 situation. So it's like either immigration is good or it's bad in great numbers and great quantities, right? So it's just like the stipulation's ridiculous. But I'm sorry to interrupt, but I felt like it was important to add that little perspective there.
No, and then it creates, and what did it do? It created a strife in Euro, where Germany and France are upset with Hungary because they're doing everything they can to stop that flow of immigration, as well as Poland and others. And then they're getting called fascists, they're getting called Putin simps, and it's like, wait a minute, if you're saying immigration is so great and you're doing it in such crazy numbers in England and France especially, then Putin's giving you a gift. He's giving you this huge gift, you know? And people really don't understand the situation right now in Europe. I mean, I talk to my friends there, and my one friend described it as there's just rats everywhere. They're just like an infestation. Every city you go to, there's just campsites and people strung across the streets, and it's absolutely crazy. Even cities like Vienna and it's becoming very widespread. So yeah, absolutely ridiculous double talk going on. And again, with the demographics is, if I know that I'm going to have that situation in the future, and I want to have the most skilled, most capable populace in that future, well, then I need to make sure I'm doing strategic moves now to set that up. Because if I succeed in the strategic moves now, while I still have, for example, enough young men to make it happen, or the industrial capacity to make it happen, then that means, if I succeed in doing these moves now to set us up for that future, then that means the likelihood of my demographic replenishment, re-strengthening of birth rates, is going to be more certain. What cracks me up about him is he doesn't once mention that, yes, you can have demographic decline, but people underestimate how rapidly you can replenish that. Okay.
Exactly. And that's the thing. His entire analysis is unidynamic. And what I mean by that, it's like, it's Malthusian in a way. It's saying, well, this is going to happen according to these trends under these conditions, blah, blah, blah. This is going to happen. No, when the reality is, yes, under these conditions, under this reality right now in this moment, like, it may happen. However, as we all know, technology and personal initiative and agency definitely has an effect on what people can do, because we're not just inordinate materialistic things. We have agency. And so, like, I guess a good example, a counter argument to his example that is based in historical fact is, for instance, the replenishment of populations after significant epidemics or wars or whatever. And like, the additional thing that he's not taking into account is the fact that the entire population bracket that's like dying off, well, like, frankly, they're more of a liability than an asset. And I mean that in the most positive way I can. But like, think about the amount of resources it takes to sustain these people, the retirement pensions, the way that they selfishly spend, the inordinate consumption that they do. And basically, like, just basically a geriatric society that kind of stifles the youth, and it under its mass has to like carry the rest of a civilization on its back. And so, the way I see it personally, it's a positive thing that these people are like, going elsewhere, because what ends up happening is, for healthy population pyramids and healthy civilizations, in reality, you don't need to live past 60. And the reality is that, like, a healthy population pyramid is like a pyramid. It's not a perfect rectangle. It's not an inverted pyramid. It's a pyramid, But I get carried away.
No, it's everything you said there is exactly the kind of, information we need to talk about, because you get a lot of doom and gloom. There's just so much doom and gloom going on, when in reality, this passing of the guard, if you will, of these older generations from the baby boom past, theoretically, that, as you said, there would be a coming explosion of internal economy growth, because now you have this excess that's of costs removed, and that brings a deflationary aspect, right, to assets like housing. And what do young people, we could talk all day about modernity and the cultural rot that we have, and especially with social media, but really one of the main drivers of why people are getting married later in life or not having kids sooner, etc., is economic. I can't afford it. I can't afford this house. I can't afford this car. I can't afford the daycare for these kids. Well, if one of those inputs, for example, housing, were to drop, right, and become more affordable, well, then that's one closer step that people are going to feel more confident to take the risks of getting married and having kids. But instead, at least here in the United States, our oligarchy does not want that to happen. They want to keep things going inflated so that they maintain their wealth, right? Or at least position themselves well when we have that deflationary cycle. And that's why, another reason why all this immigration is here. I think we already would have had a internal explosion economically from the millennial generation and the Gen X generation together, getting out there, having families and buying houses. Instead, because of the insane amount of immigration we've had here in the U.S., that all got stifled. That all got pushed off and delayed, maybe indefinitely, if they keep bringing in people at the rate that they are now under Biden. And so people really underestimate, and instead are now overestimating. Everyone's in decline. And his rhetoric, like he literally said, they want to die on their own terms. Absolutely ridiculous. What they're doing is they're using the production capacity that they have and the youth that they have to gain footholds in strategic locations that they need to do, or they feel that they need to do, right? And that is going to set them up for quite a recovery and revival down the line, right? Kind of like how Japan, he mentions in the podcast, Japan, very quickly, and then we'll go back to Russia, how, they saw their demographic decline way ahead of time. And that's why they drove such economic innovation and drove their companies to be international, so that a lot of people's economies are integrated with theirs, and vice versa. So kind of giving cushion economically down the line, right? Mm-hmm. So that's all that, Russia, China, these countries are starting to do, and they're just doing it like with way more balls and guts, right? Whereas the United States, we seem to be, every policy is going in the opposite direction, so
it reminds me too. Remember that China has this demographic oddity, which it has far more males than females, and people like him. So, okay, to give background to you legionaries out there, like there's this running school of thought in academia that, like, Jared Diamond types, who believe that, like, basically geopolitical and material conditions dictate the entirety of your life, that like your nurture is your environment. There's nothing you can do to shape your environment, right? Like you're just a helpless slave, and that nothing can change except for the happenstance of being born in one place or another. This way it absolves the individual of responsibility, of agency, and ultimately that's basically like the calling card of a liberal, is that like basically nothing's your fault. You have no agency. Everything is outside of your control. And so they apply this lens to like geopolitical takes, right? And so his take is that Russia is setting to die on its own terms. But in reality, what it is doing is setting the condition for the future of revitalizing its industrial base, as we see like the heartland of the world industrially is in East China, and it's in Russia. People don't know this, but it's not in the West anymore, obviously. And I remember reading this article too, especially from, I think it was Defense Now or some other War on the Rocks, but basically they've been disappointed with how slow the military industrial base has been to revitalize domestically. That it's been too slow, that we have been unable to keep up with the orders that Ukraine has been consuming, artillery shells, etc. But also the supply chain is compromised. It's compromised by those very belligerents who are taking part in the Ukrainian war. And people don't recognize the fact that, like, for instance, all our munitions are made domestically in China. All our smart chips are made off, 90 miles off the coast of the PRC. Those smart chips obviously go into our planes and everything else, but also into our cars. So strategically speaking, the center of gravity of the world rests in the hands of the Iranians, the Russians, and the Chinese. And also now they have an excessive population, especially China, of young men who get no pussy, who are motivated to go to war, right? So like that's, I'm serious.
like China, people at first for a long time. We'll go back to Russia because don't want to get too sidetracked here, but I used to think they're not going to invade Taiwan, but then I realized they're going to do it no matter what, because if you have all these young males who, they're not going to have a woman in their life, and the Chinese economy is changing, and some of that industrial base is leaving, well, you're going to have a lot of unemployed people. I mean, you got 1 billion people in your country, right? So this is also a way, when you have a lot of unhappy men, you can have a problem on your hands domestically, revolts and things like that. And this would be a way to like manage it is, all right, I'm just gonna throw these bodies hard and fast at an objective. And whether or not that objective pays like crazy dividends or anything like that doesn't really matter, because the objective itself, the war itself, is solving a problem for me.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. And I don't know if you saw this, but there's also this misconstrual by Zeihan about the economic circumstance of the PRC. So the PRC has this policy, which if you invest, for instance, in hard capital in China, for instance, like iPhones or Apple or whatever, people think, for instance, shareholders think that you're able to pull out to liquidate those assets that are placed in PRC territory. But actually, there's legislation in the PRC that makes it illegal to take both profits rendered by the companies and hard capital made in that country, but also it is illegal to withdraw like capital from that location, obviously under pain of like economic blockade for any specific country. But basically, okay, all that wealth that we ostensibly have attributed to our GNP is actually a quarter of the size, because really what happens is China is keeping that money that we invested in their economy, and under no circumstances, and they're powerful enough to do this, let it leave their country. So yes, it might be deindustrializing, but they also still have all that capital that's been accumulated and can be appropriated to their ends.
Which is why they push it towards building reserves, right? So yeah, let's get back to Russia. So I'm gonna kind of rattle off point by point, and of course you can interject as I go.
Go for it.
Kind of like the first 15 minutes of what he was talking about, because he made so many statements. It was also like one statement after another. So one of the first things he said, he was speaking on Russia and its geography, and how he used this phraseology of that you need to plug the gaps where there are natural boundaries like mountains or oceans. And in order for Russia to do that, they need to go all the way they need to get into Eastern Europe. So you need to get down into the Caucasus, down into the stands. And they're never going to be able to do this. And one of the reasons why he mentioned was they don't have a highway system. They do everything by rail. And the first thing I want to say is, why would that be bad? Like, the United States used to have a very robust rail system, and that resulted in fewer trucks on the road, right? Fewer congestion on the road too. And in fact, countries around the world, including Europe, would go to cities like Chicago, which had at the time, the most advanced rail infrastructure out there, and incredibly well managed. And we've divested from that and gone full, truck, over the road trucking. And what has that done other than make us even more exposed to the fluctuation of diesel and crude oil, right? And also, even if they needed a highway system in Russia, there's nothing stopping them from building it. They're acting like that building such a highway system would be an impossible task, when we've done it, Europe's done it, China has now done it in their country. So it's obviously, Russia, whatever reason, they probably are just managing their production capacity and chose to put their resources to a different thing, probably building weapons, than going full steam into a highway system, especially if your rail system is sufficient at the moment, right? I just wanted to, I'm just going to keep going through other points here. And the next thing he said is, let's see. Oh, so he's saying how they need to plug these points. They need to go and they need to be involved in the Eastern Europe. They need to be involved in the Caucasus and things like that. Every country, you have to do this. Now, the United States is the kind of like exception to this, because we only have to plug one area, and that's our southern border. We have oceans on either side. Canada is pretty much sometimes a vassal state, or sometimes just a direct ally, right? And even if they weren't, they're pretty much up in the Arctic, and it's sheer wilderness up there. So we have this luxury, and that's why you have this term in military circles and DoD of Fortress America, which is basically, it's almost impossible to, if you were to actually try and physically conquer this landmass, right? Whereas other countries don't have that luxury, right? They don't have, they have to take some geographic choke points. For example, Israel constantly wants to invade Lebanon. Why? Because if they get up there and they take the full heights, they have the Golan Heights, but the heights continues up, right, further into Lebanon. Well, if they control all the heights and on the other side of the heights, well, that's a much better geographic defensive position than not, right? That's why they're always obsessed with southern Syria. That's why they're always obsessed with invading Lebanon, and did invade Lebanon twice, right?
Of course,
unsuccessfully each time.
Yeah, no, and that's definitely a interdictionary policy. I tell you what, let's take a little smoke break here, and we'll catch up where we left off just right now, okay? All right. It's good to be back. We had to step out for a smoke break. The underground layer was too filled with, talking and stuff, so we had to get back. But anyway, we're just talking about Israel and interdiction in the region. I kind of wanted you to pick up where we left off there, War Chief. Can you go ahead and start us off?
Yeah, sure. So, I was using Israel as an example because it's a very small nation, and they're surrounded by opponents, and they've had multiple wars with those opponents, right? And you could see, why would they invade Lebanon 2 times in a row, 3 times in a row, southern Syria? Because those Golan Heights, those mountains that go up into Lebanon, that's a geographic feature that if you gain control over it, both sides of it, that's a much easier defensive position, right? So when Zeihan goes out here and says Russia needs to take Eastern Europe, they need to take the Caucasus, they need to take the stands, they need to plug these geographic features so that to really give the security that they want. Well, duh. That's what every nation does. And as I said, the United States we just have this super cherry-picked geographic features. And, that's why, as I said, again, they dub the United States as Fortress America, Other nations don't have that luxury. So he's kind of saying it as if, he's saying that they have to do this, which I may or may not agree with. However, I think what Russia can do to kind of counter him, he's just saying it in such broad generalization with no nuance. I think Russia has to plug these regions strategically, right? They don't necessarily have to take, literally go back to the Soviet Union borders, okay? But they probably need to do it strategically and definitely have influence in these regions, unquestionably, right?
Well,
go ahead.
Right, just to add to your point, the reason why, obviously economically it matters. The Ukrainian basin is a huge wheat production area, but the most important aspect is unfettered access to a warm water port. Because if you look at Russia, they all have above the Arctic Circle or near ports. Like Vladivostok on the eastern half is their only significant base, and it obviously has some significant weather issues to overcome. And then you have the Baltic, and then you have Murmansk, which is on the Arctic Ocean. So of course, it is a strategic imperative that Crimea is within the Russian Federation's control. But anyway, go ahead, continue.
Yeah, and he's making it sound like no, we wouldn't be doing the same in his shoes. It's basically what I'm trying to say here. If we were Russia, if we were there, and we want what's best for our people, and we want to have security, and we need to make sure we have these boxes checked off, the same thing would be going on. So this idea that, kind of like what you were saying earlier about how he makes it seem like there's no agency, that, yes, in some cases I have to take a physical location, but there's many ways to go about things. There's many strategies that Russia could employ. And, it's also, it's just the way he just explains it, and the reason why I'm going through the first 15 minutes of the podcast, point for point is, I'm sure your audience, may be aware that people on the left or people well connected in DC, they kind of hit you with a word salad. They kind of hit you, speaking very quickly, and they're saying lots of things in a very short breath, and it kind of inoculates the normal sort of viewer. That's why if you watch the podcast, Joe Rogan is going like, oh, woo, oh, he's like sighing, and like he's just getting inoculated by him speaking and very quickly with all these points, Whereas if I was sitting there 10 times, I would have, in those first 15 minutes, I'd be like, whoa, wait a minute. You can't just say this, and this, like all back to back, nonchalant, right? So that's kind of what I'm doing here. I'm trying to.
But haven't you done acid, man? Dude,
yeah. Did he bring that up? Joe Rogan always seems to bring up some kind of drug. Like, come on, man. Like,
yeah, the guy always, like, I think he's so fried mentally that, like, I mean, I guess the format of his show is not to contradict his guests. So I think to measure it is important, but also, like, the guy, like, also is probably not at all A, interested, or B, like, involved with this. I'm pretty sure Joe Rogan was coerced in some form or another, or influenced to have this guy on,
Yeah, it is kind of odd, the timing, and also he was only, usually Joe's podcast, they kind of a little less structured, and it's more conversationalist, right? And that didn't seem like that, at least for the first 30 minutes, right, of that podcast. It didn't feel like that. It felt like he, not, I wouldn't say scripted, but like it did feel kind of not his usual vibe, like that you would get, and which, again, makes me feel, especially when, Zeihan is talking about Russia, that it's really pushing a lot of propaganda. So also when he spoke about, Russia needs to needs to expand into these areas, he also was talking about, Joe Rogan, one of the only times he did counter him was he asked the question, what do you think that, NATO is the one that kind of caused this conflict, because he, NATO keeps expanding into the east. And he did speak on that. He said, well, yes, that is part of the equation. And I just want to give like some color with that, because it's one thing that you have nations joining NATO. It's another thing that those militaries then become integrated with ours. Then we deploy weapons to those countries, interballistic missiles, pretty serious weapons, air bases. And then it's another thing that we actually, we bombed several Eastern European countries that, weren't cooperating, if you will, like we had the whole Kosovo situation in the 90s, okay, and we bombed Belgrade. Well, when we bombed Belgrade, a lot of Russians were like, hey, what the F, and culturally they saw that as, we didn't give a shit about Slavs, we didn't give a shit about people that have that kind of culture, and that did damage, to us, right? Because, even at that time when the Soviet Union was collapsing, Russians actually viewed the United States in good light. Next thing you know, a couple months later, we're bombing their kinsmen, if you will, or distant kinsmen, if you will, in that region. And he, of course, Zeihan isn't going to mention that. He's not going to mention the actual conflicts we've had there and bloodshed that has happened there. So it isn't just a NATO alliance that's moving forward. It's a NATO alliance. It's weapons, military integrations, propaganda, psyops, and when people didn't cooperate, when people didn't go with the anti-Russian agenda, you had coups and you had invasions. So it's all of this story of the 90s and early 2000s that are left out, and people don't think about this, and they don't think about that. We've antagonized Russia multiple times, in Georgia, in what do you call it? I can't think of the word right now. It's just escaped me. Grozny, the Chechens, right? The first Chechen war, you can argue, was very nationalistic. These were Chechens that wanted to separate from the Soviet Union and everything, and Russia. But towards the second half of that conflict, what happened? You had all these Islamist extremists that were brought into that region and became proxy forces, basically, of NATO in the West, causing pain for Russia. And it was very similar to what's going on in Ukraine. It was a slugfest, right? And that war, the Chechen War, is what prompted Putin's rise, because he's the one that started putting in the right men in the right mindset and strategy to get that conflict resolved. So Zeihan is leaving out like all of this context and again, this is like the first 15 minutes, and without these, if I mention Kosovo to heck a millennial, let alone a Gen Zer, they have no idea what the heck that is. They probably even heard of it, that we were involved there in bombing people, and again, Chechnya and Georgia. So this is huge context that's involved here. It isn't just, NATO moved here and we made loose agreements, I would say, with the former Soviet Union, that no, we wouldn't expand deep into the Visegrad like regions of Eastern Europe, and then we did, right? And then we bombed people, and then we deployed missiles all over the place in Turkey and Romania and etc. So he kind of he acknowledged it, like, yes, that's part of the equation, but then he kind of just went right back to just bashing Russia, that, they have to take Ukraine, they have to take Poland, they have to take the Baltics. And whether or not he's right, I don't know, for all I know, that is a desire that Russia has to reclaim all of that territory. But, right now, I think, the point that I'm trying to make here is Zeihan is leaving out all this context, and it's not necessarily fair to color the situation. I mean, maybe you can gloss over it, maybe you can brush it aside, but all these events are leading up to and including, hey, Russia, they know they have this demographic situation that's going to be happening. They know that the world is also facing that same situation. Well, look what they've done to us already. Look what they've, little nibbles here and there along our perimeter, along our frontier. Well, we need to nip this in the bud. So, again, many of these things are kind of inevitable, and there's always an option B. I mean, there's always an option where we didn't do the things that we did, that we didn't antagonize Russia in this way. Maybe things could have been different. I'm not going to 100% be this determinist here, but I just wanted to kind of bring that point. And then in that same 15 minutes, we kind of, he starts talking about how, another thing he said is that it's a multi-decade conflict. I don't necessarily know what he means. Like, I can't really foresee, and maybe you can give your input, how this could be multi-decade. I mean, this isn't Afghanistan. This isn't low intensity fighting going on here. This is as high intensity as it gets, with pretty much every battle implement that you have being used.
I think that's just a Freud. I don't want to interrupt too hard, but like, I do think it's a Freudian slip on his part, because he says that it's a conflict between Ukraine and Russia, but then he says it's going to be a multi-decade conflict. What he really meant was that it's going to be a multi-decade confrontation between the United States and Russia, not between Ukraine and Russia, because whatever happens within the next few months, it will be resolved one way or another. And I think, frankly, by just pure military analysis alone, it will come out in the favor of the Russians quite handily. Now, the objective that he's talking about is like this idea that we have re-entered, in his own words, a world of the 19th century, where there are basically great powers who have proxy wars and small wars, conflicts for supremacy. And I think what he's referencing is like this thing that they constantly talk about is like the Thucydides trap, a bunch of the sounds there. But anyway, point being is, like, a lot of the time, this guy, how do you say this? He makes Freudian slips and alliterations just to get you to cognitively conflate two different things. One is the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, and one is the wider conflict, which Ukraine serves as a proxy of American power. Well, specifically liberal power, which is, obviously oligarchs' control, so it's not really American, but that's beside the point. Now, we keep on talking about like this conflict and this thing that's happening, and I frankly, I mean, I'm a lot less sanguine about than most people about Russia winning necessarily. I do think that they're incurring significant losses. I think that they're finding themselves in a position which is like, it also is beneficial for them to take a stand, but it's also, it comes at a cost. You know what I mean? It's not easy. It's not a walk in the park. However, I think there are some significant developments which are probably going to improve their situation and those of their allied nations, which has to do with the balkanization of the internet. Now, people like don't understand how Ukraine and all these other former Soviet republics came into the grips of the Western powers. Obviously, it's very, you know, lucrative personally and aspirational to join the United States, but what is it that really netted this international circumstance? I was just reading, for instance, Pete, what's his name, Pete Greer or something like that, on the internet. I think he's pretty good. I don't really disagree with him a lot, but I disagree with him on the concept that like Russia is losing. I don't think Russia is losing. I think specifically, strategically speaking, it's winning. Why? Because we're starting to realize, just like the Chinese realized a long time ago, how important it is to control the internet. Because if you control the internet, you control the narrative. If you control the narrative, you control how people think and ultimately go towards. And so what's happening now is a lot of these younger generation, Gen Z, Russians and stuff are like supporters of Navalny and like liberals and like have weird liberal like circumstances and fetishes and stuff. And frankly, the reason why that is because of the internet, which is an American innovation and it's American dominated. And so the best way that Russia can proceed into the future and have some stability and avoid these kind of internet weapons of psyop weapons is by simply doing what China does, which is a great firewall kind of situation. Or if at some time in the future they're able to like make their internet completely by hardware and otherwise independent of the, you know, American centered data centers. But I mean, we'll see about that. I mean, what do you think about that?
Yeah, the kind of going into, I mean, the internet is just the most intensive of fifth gen warfare. That node, which is comprised of many different nodes of many different media formats, including social media, probably the most intense space where our governments are leveraging their most of their assets are now being leveraged in that. I mean, I'm sure you've seen articles recently that, you know, in Germany, they have so many assets and agents devoted to infiltrating right-wing stuff that they now have to communicate with each other so they don't dox each other or attack one another. You know, because they even lost track of how many people are actually going around pretending to be these right-wing extremists pushing for violence, right? So it's probably the most intense space where the West is leveraging the majority of their resources because it, you know, the cost input and what you get in return is huge, right? You know, if I have some guys, some commentators, media celebrities, internet celebrities, and they influence a good chunk of your population right in Moscow, like right in your capital, I mean, that's weapon, right? That's just as good as me moving a ballistic missile right into Ukraine, right? So, yeah, I believe that if you create a situation, a war, and a direct war, well, now your government can use an imperative to say, okay, well, we're going to censorship this stuff here because this is our enemy. Whereas before, you know, the censorship thing I mean, we've been seeing it now for years. They're slowly censoring any kind of dissident voice, obviously domestically. And then now they're censoring any kind of input from abroad, right? And the U.S. is not 100% doing that because their confidence in how brainwashed their populace is domestically. Yeah, they're not going to 100%. They're not going to block RT just yet. You know, Russia Today. So can still see.
There's also no significant, like, you know, how do you say, ideological. How do you say
counterculture going on?
Counterculture. Yeah. There's nothing really powerfully like convincing to be on guard against. You know what I mean? So it is still very difficult to access. You know what I mean?
Yeah. But getting back into some of the details that he was talking about, for example, he started mentioning how that the Russians were extremely incompetent in the initial phases of the invasion of Ukraine, and that's an area that's some commentary that I actually agreed with him on. That I still can't fathom and understand why the Russian intelligence apparatus completely shit the bed with completely underestimating how resilient the Ukrainian men were going to be, and how they were very much ready to put up strong resistance. You had 7 years to gather intelligence between the 2014 invasion and now, and it still boggles my mind that they shit the bed there. And also, there is, he mentions there's poor leadership and throughout the command chain of the Russian forces. I would agree with that. A lot of that is the legacy from the Soviet era, where, in fact, I think Russia has a certain term for it, some kind of Russian term for it. I can't remember what it is, but it's basically like you have commanders. You have a low-level commander who's saying, "Hey, we took heavy casualties. We need reinforcements." Then the commander above him says, "Oh, they didn't take that many casualties. They don't need that many reinforcements." Then the commander above him is, "They didn't take any casualties, so we don't need to send reinforcements." And then it finally goes to Putin and says, "Oh, we achieved victory at that location." You know what I'm saying? Like it's like there's like a phrase for it. It's like lying their way up the chain, because of just how the old Soviet Union era was, where you could end up in a gulag, right?
Yeah,
so,
you just don't give bad how do you say? You don't give bad news,
Yeah.
It's your head.
But he doesn't want to, so we can all agree that the initial invasion was totally botched, both from an intelligence aspect. Also, the fact that they spread their forces across such a vast amount of territory, as opposed to the American style of warfare and invasion was we would have concentrated all of our forces into one location and just spearheaded that shit straight to Kiev.
Yeah, that's the thing, is that I agree with you. Like the initial invasion was completely botched, like period. And I think the thing is their intel was bad, and so the military operation not only was it poorly conducted, but I think what they meant it as is a show of force, and they deployed their more elite forces, their tier 2 assets like the VDV, etc., at places which they knew that there was going to be some kind of like military how do you say, resistance. But I don't think they were ready for the amount of resistance across the whole country. Like,
yes,
which is part of the reason why they were operating in like a battalion-sized elements instead of brigades, and instead of like whole divisional lines and stuff like that. I'm sure my Hearts of Iron fans out there are kind of like spurging out about it. But what I'm trying to tell you is that they were operating almost as a peacekeeping mission, much in the same way that we deployed our forces in Kosovo, etc., because we actually didn't have the same kind of battle array as we did in Desert Storm or elsewhere. But yeah, no, please continue. But I agree with you. Like it by and large, that is the case. You know what I mean? That it was poorly executed on very bad human intelligence.
Yeah, and it left me scratching my head. And however, he also mentioned right around that time, right around that minute mark in the podcast, he started also mentioning that they're totally incompetent, and they're not able to adapt. They're not able to recover from supply chain shocks. So he mentioned, the Kerch Bridge getting struck. Last time I checked, it already is practically repaired. I mean, maybe we could fact check that later, but
no, it's repaired. I just checked. It's repaired.
Yeah, exactly. So, this podcast wasn't that long ago, and it's like, wait a minute, dude, like that already got repaired. Like that got struck, and it was a show of force of what these MLRS pieces of equipment that we've supplied can achieve. Deep penetration strikes. But they repaired it. It's a rail, right? It's not. This isn't like super duper. And the HIMARS, unless they get the more upgraded versions, with heavier munitions, they're not strong enough to really do devastating infrastructure shocks. That requires much larger munition.
From what I understand, the strike on the Kerch Bridge was done by literally a truck full of explosives that was remotely detonated, and the driver didn't know that he was sitting on explosives. So it was basically like a terrorist type MO. It was kind of weird.
Yeah, exactly. And then as far as Russians adapting their tactics, they've tremendously adapted. They adapted very quickly. And we can start seeing the results of that with the victory in Soledar, where, Wagner, their mercenary group that was one of the key spearheads in that attack, they're getting all the credit, they're getting all the press because, big scary mercenary corporation, even though our military has used contractors out the wazoo for the past 20 years. But what people also fail to understand that along with Wagner, you had the VDV deployed again, and they took the outer flanks of Soledar. And as Wagner was hammering and spearheading, and these tactical movements is clearly a demonstration of them adjusting their battle doctrine, and it succeeded. And they took Soledar, and now they're taking the Mikovinka and a couple, I can't pronounce their names, to the south of Bakhmut. So now Soledar is north of Bakhmut. They're taking positions to the south, and they're achieving their strategic goal of encircling Bakhmut. So he's saying they're incompetent. They're saying this, and yes, in the beginning of this invasion, as we said, definitely a lot of incompetence is there, but these things are getting ironed out, and they're getting ironed out very quickly. And to the credit of Ukrainians, so have they. They're constantly adjusting and all that. And what cracks me up is he says that there's incompetence in that leadership, especially in the kill chain. But then later in the podcast, he mentions how we are in control of the Ukrainian kill chain. When artillery is striking and when HIMARS missiles are being fired, especially probably HIMARS, we're the ones involved in the kill chain. We're the ones providing them the intelligence. We're providing them now the battle plans. If you look at the counteroffensives in Kherson, and particularly Kharkiv, they were 100% textbook American maneuvers, that we as if Americans were in those vehicles ourselves. So
yeah, it's actually called a Thunder Run, which people don't know about, but we took Baghdad. It's basically an innovation on what is colloquially called blitzkrieg, and I don't know why at this point we don't just call it blitzkrieg and not spurt out about it, but whatever. But the point being is yeah, you're absolutely correct. The way that the Ukrainian forces were deployed and their battle array was completely written by an American advisor. I mean, there's no way it wasn't. And the way that they carry out mechanized warfare is literally our doctrine for the 1980s. It's carbon copied. It's insane. So
yeah.
Continue.
Yeah, and then the next sort of minute after that, he mentions how kind of further digging into how horrible the Russians and how much casualties they took. And don't get me wrong, both sides are really racking up casualties. And I will say that I think Ukraine has taken just as many troop casualties as Russia, if not more, because there weren't as many Russian infantry to begin with. And the reason why I say that is because some of the major reasons why those BTRs, those battalion tactical units, failed or were miserably defeated was because those brigades, what people don't realize is it's high firepower, but you also need a lot of infantry, right? An IFE and a tank aren't very effective on their own. They're effective with unison to infantry, and infantry on their own aren't effective without having armor, right? And Russia had basically all metal, no blood. And that's why you see all these tanks destroyed. You see all these IFEs. So when you look at the casualty sheet, yes, Russia is taking more equipment casualties. But I would argue that Ukraine didn't have a lot of equipment to begin with. In fact, what's kept them alive is capturing Russian equipment. So they probably have taken more blood. They had more blood and less metal, right? And they probably had, I would surmise, if I was trying to cut through the propaganda, that actual infantry, actual men on the ground casualties is probably similar, where but maybe Ukraine took more infantry casualties and Russia definitely took more equipment casualty. And speaking of equipment, he then mentions how the javelins and manpads, armored ATGMs were specifically used against trucks, and they got all of their trucks wiped out, right? Because that's your major piece where you're moving your supply chain is by truck. And now they're, he said like, oh, they're going back to Russia and they're getting school buses and they're getting like ordinary trucks to now move stuff, which is probably true to an extent. But he fails to understand that, like, if we were doing a similar invasion, our supply chain would be just as vulnerable. We move everything by truck, also. Okay, you're not going to be airlifting howitzers into position in a air defense environment like Ukraine right now. It's going to be moved by truck, and those trucks would be just as vulnerable to the Cornet and other ATGM systems, just as Russia was. So I'm just throwing that out there as kind of like a counterpoint. That was a note I had. And, again, to an American, they don't understand these kinds of operations. And, you just mentioned the Blitzkrieg of Baghdad. Heck, man, we had, all the Marines and all these guys were moving so quickly, they were leaving those trucks behind, which then became vulnerable to attack. Okay. And that was with a force, in Iraq in 2003, right?
Yeah, it's interesting because it's like we have this false bravado. I remember in my time in the military talking to people, and like there's this thing in the military sphere that, oh, we won the Afghan war, like we won every battle. It's like, dude, how can you not learn that, tactical battles don't imply strategic effects, but also, okay, like let's assume that your technique, like you won the war. The reality is you fought a war against someone that was technologically incapable. So there's this false bravado of like saying, oh, we won every firefight, blah, blah, blah. But the reality is that, like, dude, you fought against someone that was far your lesser, that didn't, like, I think one of the most common sightings of a American victory over Russia about how a war with Russia would go is this incursion that happened in Syria, where like a Wagner force of Wagner recruits locals like Syrians and stuff. So it's like led by like maybe 10-15 Russians in the command center. The rest were like Syrians and like other assorted like mercenaries and sellswords who were advancing on a YPG, which is a Kurdish militia outpost that had SEALs stationed there because obviously they're our proxy. And then basically, they had no air cover, they had no like support, they had no artillery support. They were just advancing with tanks and like some self-propelled guns and infantry, heavily infantry. And it was not even it's like two companies. It's not even a battalion-sized element. And then we annihilated them with an AC-130 and like JDAMs and like howitzer like artillery, and we were like, oh yeah, we totally kicked their butt. That's how the Russians are gonna go. It's like, dude, you were fighting in a situation where Russians weren't even fighting you. That was Wagner, and Russia is adamant about not supporting them on a military basis to avoid head-on collisions with the United States. The Russians did not interdict with their jet fighters, even though they could. They have jet engine, a fighter squadron in Latakia in Syria. They didn't interdict or give them fire support with remote guns and stuff. So it was completely just another circumstance where they were beating down on someone that was far their lesser and think to themselves that they're like the shit at war, which is, I mean, a hubris of a very special and stupid kind,
Yeah, and to quickly keep on to that talking point, two things he said that were just like absolutely just completely mean was he compared that Russia's performance so far was equivalent to Iraq in 1991, 1992, the first Gulf War. Absolutely ridiculous comparison, and I want to dig deeper into that. And then he made another statement where if NATO did get involved right now directly against Russia, it would be 1,000 to 1 casualty rate. absolutely asinine meme. I don't even know if there's any war in history that I know of where somebody achieved a one, maybe like the Boer Wars, against totally unarmed, like indigenous, groups and tribes. Like, it's absolutely ridiculous meme for him to be even saying that, especially if you're even remotely educated in modern conflict right now. And just to kind of dig, I know I'm going to sound like super autistic right now, so let's prep the audience real quick, because I just can't stand, everybody just constantly they scratch their head and then they boast and say that, oh, I can't understand how Russia just didn't take the country like in 6 months. And even Peter says this, he's like, oh, I thought they would take it and this would be over in 6 months. And you have a lot of people mentioning Russia, since they have the second largest air force, why couldn't they achieve air superiority and stuff like that? So I want to just dig into that just a little bit. So one, we mentioned many times already, the first Gulf War in Iraq. And I don't think a lot of Americans, even though it wasn't that long ago, it's already kind of fading into myth and legend. I mean, it was already super propagandized, right? But even now more so. And so trying to give the audience right now some really strong perspective of what's really, what are you really saying when you say Russia needs to achieve air dominance in Ukraine, okay? So in the Gulf War, in the first Gulf War, in Iraq, in the Desert Storm, right? I'm not going to speak on Desert Shield. Desert Shield was kind of a smaller operation compared to Desert Storm, right? In Desert Storm, we had 43,000 sorties in 43 days. So that's about 930 sorties a day, and that's about one sortie per aircraft per day, okay? And to totally dominate that country, all the targets within that country, because people don't understand, hitting an airbase, you can't just hit the airbase once, okay? You got to keep hitting it over and over again, okay? Because you can quickly repair a hangar, you can quickly repair a runway, you can move aircraft overnight so that, you thought they were there that night and then they were gone because they moved them. So you have to keep it, it's not just, air dominance isn't just, oh, I hit this target once and it's done. Like, no, it's suppression. You're bombing it on a regular basis, right? With impunity, essentially. And even in this 43 days, almost 1,000 sorties a day, we still took 45 casualties. 45 combat aircraft were struck down by Iraqi air defenses, okay? And this is in 1991, right? And at the end of those 43 days, at the end of the operation, if we had to keep going, if we had to keep suppressing the country, a lot of our airframes were already hitting their limits, and you're going to have a lot of weapons or a lot of aircraft come off for maintenance, okay? Because people don't understand, maintaining combat aircraft is pretty intensive, right? And so that shows you that in the Gulf War, to suppress a country that had a relatively minuscule air defense and air force required 1,000 aircraft to fly all of them once every day for 43 days, right? And we still took 45 aircraft down. To put that in perspective, if the United States was to do the same thing to Ukraine is almost double the size of Iraq. And they have a much more capable air force, much more capable air defense, much more well-trained operatives behind those equipment. So we would have to at least do 2,000 sorties a day. Well, we don't even have that many aircraft to conduct that kind of a dominance, okay? And so when we look at Russia has 1,000 aircraft total. Well, they can't commit all that aircraft to Ukraine. They still have to have air bases and other locations of the country to keep for rear guard, right? You can't just put all that aircraft into one conflict. You're going to be leaving yourself exposed. Also, only about 60, maybe 80% of that aircraft are actually combat ready. And so you're probably left with maybe 200 to 300 aircraft that you can devote every day to this conflict in Ukraine, which at best is, 200 to 400 sorties a day. And yet, they have been able to heavily suppress the air defenses and air forces of Ukraine across the entire country, not just the regions that they took. And how Russia achieves that is through asymmetry, by leveraging their air defense technologies, S-300, S-400, Buk, Tor, Panzer, you know, these layered air defenses. And then another example is, you know, because of the airspace right now in Ukraine, a lot of Ukrainian aircraft have no choice but to fly low. When you fly low, your aircraft is going to move slower, right? And what, you know, one way that Russia uses asymmetry, I'm just using it as a quick autistic example, if you let me indulge, please. You know, they launch a MiG-31 up into, you know, MiG-31s are very fast-moving interceptors that were used to chase after the SR-71 back in the Cold War. And Russia didn't know if this was even worth, you know, they might want to retire these aircraft. But then they found out that, wait a minute, we can have these guys launch really fast, get to the high altitude so they're out of range of Ukrainians' air defense. He then shoots a missile.
The MiG-25, the Foxbat. I know what you're talking about. Yep.
The 31 is the progenitor after that. So it goes way up high altitude very quickly, detects that MiG-29 that's moving on low altitude to try and hit a Russian target of some kind. So then the MiG shoots a missile at that MiG-29, right? Well, the MiG-29 has plenty of time. You know, he knows that you know, they're gonna have plenty of time to detect that missile coming at him. Okay, but what does it do? It forces the MiG-29 to abandon his mission in order to evade that missile. So that MiG-31 just achieved a mission kill. Okay, so he didn't destroy the Ukrainian aircraft, but he achieved a mission kill, right? So here's a quick example of the kind of asymmetry that's going on there, and it's totally changing air combat and air warfare, right? And of course, normies have no idea about Desert Storm and how many sorties it took just to suppress Iraq, and how we would need at least double that to achieve a similar effect in Ukraine. And it's just not in the cards for Russia, and they know that. So they use their forces asymmetrically and strategically, and they don't have air dominance, but they certainly have air superiority. Otherwise, we would see more and more bombing runs by Ukrainian air forces, but we don't, right? And I just wanted to give that sort of autistic breakdown because I constantly see this in chats. I constantly see it in mainstream media that, oh, why didn't they take it in 6 months? Why didn't they take this? Oh, man, America is so amazingly powerful because look what we did in Iraq. And then he goes on there, Zeihan, and he's sitting there saying, Russia's performance is similar to the Iraqi forces in 1990. Absolutely ridiculous. And by the way, this entire 200 to 400 sorties a day that Russia has been doing, plus missile bombardments from their fleet in the Black Sea, over the past 6 months, they've only taken 50 aircraft out, actual combat aircraft. I'm not including helicopters at the moment. I'm talking about actual fighters and strike bombers.
Right. To add to your point, which is probably the widest, most glaring issue that like analysts and normies alike don't see, is that the doctrine of the Russian Federation is much that of the Soviet Union. And what I mean by air warfare is that they chose instead to for instance, in the United States, we have a lot of emphasis on air power to augment as combat power a force multiplier on the battlefield to destroy the enemy by the air, usually. Well, the Russians are like, okay, we don't have the same industrial base and like capability as Western countries to field a like crap ton of airframes, right? So what they chose to do is do an interdiction model. So to nullify air combat capability, the Russians instead focused on having, AA as a prominent part of the defensive air shield that they are able to, sprawl out amongst their different units. So, for instance, in the United States, we actually don't have that strong of a, anti-air interdiction circumstance that we usually do, right? But
exactly.
In Russia, they have actually doubled the anti-air gun batteries for divisional and brigade-sized elements. Because their aim is to focus on artillery fires to destroy the enemy, not air power.
Yeah.
But anyway, yeah. I get ahead of myself.
Yeah.
But let's move on to the next point. What was your next point, by the way?
My next point really, that kind of wraps up sort of the in those first 15 minutes, he kind of threw all these like little details. Oh, blowing up trucks, incompetency, they can't achieve air power, they can't achieve maneuverability. So I'm just kind of countering all that, and me giving the analysis or the kind of breakdown with the Gulf War and all that is hopefully putting people in perspective that they don't have anywhere near the Air Force that we had and all this, and yet they are achieving. They are taking a landmass that's twice the size of Iraq slowly. All this is happening slowly. You can say, you can argue, but such is this war. And such is a war against a adversary that's pretty well equipped. And remember, they probably would have had even more success if we weren't coming in there, managing the kill chain directly, managing the intelligence directly, providing them ridiculous amounts of ammunition, weapons, okay, and then taking it even further and being like, hey, we're going to plan your counteroffensive for you. So people really need to put in perspective. They need these perspectives. They need us giving this kind of perspective, because otherwise you're really going to get swallowed up into this brouhaha of kind of like what you said earlier with the whole Wagner fight that happened in Syria. Absolutely ridiculous. It was like on Fox News. It was on like every major channel and media output, where it's just like, oh yeah, we annihilated like 300 of them and blah blah blah, like as if it was some kind of crazy epic battle, when really it was just, hey, we dropped a bunch of like guns on them. Like it's just ridiculous. And I want to transition now to kind of sort of after that 15 minutes, he kind of went into the demographics, which we talked about already. We kind of talked about Russia's demographic situation, which is the same situation that more or less that pretty much every other nation is facing, except for the third world areas such as Southeast Asia and Africa. And then he kind of goes into he briefly starts talking about how Putin, he's surrounded by yes men. He's surrounded by men that aren't telling him like legitimately what's really going on, and just creating an illusion, and that he's purged so much of his leadership that the leadership now doesn't have the sort of brain capacity, if you will, to really move forward and innovate and problem solve. And I just sit there, and when I hear him talk about this, I'm sure it's true to an extent. It is true to an extent that you purge hard like that, and you don't have anybody too afraid to speak up. He mentioned this also with China, and I absolutely think that that's definitely true in China. But I don't know why, and maybe I can get your opinion too. But I couldn't help but think that the same is probably true in Europe, the Eurozone, and United States. I mean, look at
look at the United States, dude. I mean, like,
look at Biden.
About to say.
Look at that guy.
Yeah. Dude, I'm telling you, like, if you have any experience with the modern military, unless if you're like a diehard liberal, like, you are actively being like persecuted and forced out of the military. I mean, this is happening on an institutional level, not even a personal level, right? Because like, if you go to Russia and you talk to a low-level like cop or whatever, like, or military service member or whatever, like, they have people of all different stripes. They have communists to like fascists to Democrats, small d Democrats, not big D, and basically like all kinds of different like personal convictions. But obviously as you go up the ladder, you have to be more of a Putinite. But in America, it's like top down, like everyone from your smallest janitor to everyone has to be completely on board, or you're actively like treated like a second class citizen. But you're absolutely right, and I think American combat power is one of those things that, like, we're basing our personal prestige off of the Second World War, and many people don't understand that our victory in the Second World War hinged more on our industrial capacity and our ability to logistically sustain the rest of the world in combat, right, as opposed to actually being proficient war fighters ourselves. And like, that's something that people don't understand. And then secondarily, okay, like, let's assume that we got good at war or something, but at the end of the day, we didn't, right? Like, we're the reason why we're considered the preeminent military power is because we're the preeminent economic power. All right, Legionnaires, we had enemy EW attacking us. That's electronic warfare. So here we're back. Just a couple more questions, if we could just transition here. What are some other points, final points here, that Zeihan, that you thought was like the most disturbing or the most incorrect? If you could just enlighten us.
Yeah, just some final comments to kind of wrap up this whole Russia segment of the podcast. And these last points are pretty salient. So he, for a moment there, he was, it was right around the part of the podcast where they're talking about the different propaganda tactics. And he mentions, and he kind of does a Freudian slip where he talks about Trump, and he talks about how, imagine if Trump, in order to galvanize his base, and he says the radical evangelicals, or the evangelical base of America. And I remember when he says that, he has a Freudian slip where, how can I describe this without upsetting half the country? So it's weird that, when he's talking about the pro-Russian propaganda that's trying to galvanize and reshape the narrative for Russians to be for the war, he mentions Trump and he mentions evangelicals. And I kind of see that as a Freudian slip, because remember, Zeihan is a mouthpiece of, one of the many mouthpieces, or nodes, if you will, of the oligarchy and the elite here in the United States. So it just goes again to show, why are they always attacking the right, and especially the Christian right? And it always fascinates me because, when I think of an evangelical Christian, I just see a conservative. I just see someone who's just, they're kind of brainwashed on some things that may not be right, but yet they are still, the elite sees them as kind of like a threat domestically. And that's why, I think our circles and those of us on the far right, we need to kind of back off our rhetoric that's against the normie conservative, because that's kind of like a bastion of resource that we need to actually tap into. So I just kind of want to make that comment. And then Zeihan also mentions how for the past 20 years we've been, the GWAT, right? Global War on Terror, and how that's actually hindered us in actually engaging in conventional warfare with a symmetric adversary, such as Russia, such as China. And he correctly makes the point that, the hole in analytics and analysts and talent in the industrial complex is basically long-term planning, especially logistics and weapon systems that are actually going to be effective, not in a counterinsurgency, but in a actual direct conflict with an adversary. And military industrial complex is already making very big strides, with the announcement of a lighter tank that's being produced. They're already kind of moving in those directions. However, I would mention that, not everything from GWAT isn't able to cross over. We had very intense urban combats in Iraq, Fallujah and Najaf. And urban combat, like that, is always intense. And that's definitely going to be a transferable sort of skill set into a modern conflict like we see in Ukraine, where there is a lot of urban combat as they take city after city, right? And also, later, maybe a topic for a later date, I always found it suspicious that for 20 years we just had this hubris where we're not going to be fighting any conventional adversaries, and we're only going to be dealing with insurgencies. And then we fine-tuned that counterinsurgency force. It always made me feel that it was kind of nefarious in nature, possibly in the future with a American civil conflict of some kind. And another thing that's definitely transferable, he kind of gives an example that the intelligence apparatus of the United States basically was hyper-focused on minute details like, oh, there's an enemy combatant in this building, and we need to know what side the hinges of the door on for the breach for our special forces. And what cracks me up is all that fine-tuning of our intelligence apparatuses to get a minute detail like that is definitely transferable to a conflict like Ukraine or a conventional conflict. And that is why you see Ukraine being able to make precision strikes and have really good intel, because all the intelligence apparatus that was focused on insurgents in Afghanistan is now focused on huge mass formations and supply chains of huge military forces in Ukraine right now. So that's definitely transferable. I mean, he's kind of making it sound like it was a detriment. It's the intelligence side, I said, it would not be, but maybe some of the aspects in our military industrial complex. And another comment kind of adding to that is, in the headlines, we see lots of headlines kind of capturing, constantly talking about the amount of equipment we're sending to Ukraine. And you even have some in the DoD. I remember seeing like a Navy admiral not too long ago at a conference or so, basically saying that, hey, we're like wasting a lot of our ammunition, we're wasting a lot of our equipment, and we may not be able to we're getting to a point where we might not be able to replenish it for our own selves. I haven't been able to figure out how much of these statements are true or not true. The most I've seen from my research, and this would have to be dug way more into, but I think in 1997 there was an audit, with the DoD on how many artillery shells we had. And because of just years of the Cold War, just building up artillery shells, the audit concluded I think 21 million shells in our arsenals, and then they estimated that Russia had around 30 million or more. And that's why, so far we've transferred, I think, over 1 million shells to Ukraine. I think in total they're saying that we have 3 million in total. But I'm just sitting here scratching my head. What happened to the other 17 million? I mean, I know 1997 was
what happened. What happened
ago,
to
but...
What happened to the $2 trillion in the Pentagon?
Yeah, exactly. So, part of me is scratching my head. I mean, I know there's maintenance costs but I mean, if Russia is pulling stores of weapons that are rusty and they just retrofit them and get them ready for battle, I mean, I don't see why we wouldn't be able to do so. So this idea that we don't have enough arms to send to them, I kind of am suspicious about that, which is why maybe his Freudian slip that he said earlier about how this is a decades-long conflict, they know that we, if that 20 million is still floating around, even if it's only half that, 10 million, right? That means we can send 1 million shells a year for 10 years, right? Because it's almost been a year since the start of the invasion, and we've sent 1 million shells, right? So I don't know how I feel about the whole arms thing. I definitely think tanks and equipment like that are much harder to replace, but shells and things like this, man pads, who the heck knows how large our stockpiles are? And I don't think 20 years ago is that too long ago, and just wanted to make a comment on that. And really, the arms situation has more to do with our European allies not sending as much as they should, particularly Germany, right? That's kind of been the thorn in their side. And really just the last comment to kind of tie off this whole Russian commentary that Zeihan gives here. And this one is probably, people watching the podcast probably, you probably missed this, but this was probably his biggest Freudian slip, was towards the end there before they transitioned into talking about China. And he basically says that, Russia is now scarier than ever because, they're aggressively taking these positions. They're aggressively taking, they want to take over Europe. They want to take over these choke points that he describes. But he also mentions how they are re-embracing their cultural aspects, particularly their religion. And it's funny how he says the Soviet Union was less scary in the eyes of Europe and the West, was less scary because they were putting aside, this was, I think, almost what he said exactly, putting aside their weird religion, and morphing into a well thought out and developed technocracy. So he literally said the word technocracy, and he's saying that them doing this, putting aside their religion and becoming a more reformed technocracy, was a good thing that the West viewed on the Soviet Union. So there's multiple things to unpack here. One, if you were a baby boomer and you grew up in the Cold War, that would be mind-boggling to you, because we were all brainwashed to think that this was the greatest evil that's ever existed on Earth, and that they are our greatest adversary during the entire Cold War. And now he's sitting here saying that, oh, actually, they were viewed favorably by the elite because they were doing and practicing, moving into a direction that they also want to move to. So that's essentially what remember, he's a mouthpiece. He's part of the accepted sort of folk that are now in the in circle. He's probably not in the top inner circles, but he's relatively in the in circle, in the in crowd, if you will, of DOD, of DC, and all these elites, all these mouthpieces, right? And what are these guys obsessed with? These guys are obsessed with the notion of moving all societies, not just the West, not just the East, but moving all societies into a technocracy. And this is why over the years we've had the dismantling of monarchies, a dismantling of strong decentralized republics, and everything is moving into these unionized, centralized economic and political blocs like the EU. And then, of course, as much as they relent about China and Xi, China is a perfect shining example of the kind of technocracy they want to achieve, particularly those elites that are from Silicon Valley. So it's a huge Freudian slip if you're someone who's been studying these subject matters and you've been kind of seeing, from their own mouthpieces, from their own literature, from guys from George Soros and others, Henry Kissinger, all these guys, they are all been in favor of technocracy. And this even goes back to the first technocracy societies of the 1920s and 30s, where, they had their own sort of departments in many different universities like Stanford. And they've been wanting to achieve this, and they've been moving societies in that direction. And what I find interesting is it seems like they don't mind when a totalitarian society that's anti-religion, anti-God, anti its cultural heritage, as long as it's moving, especially if it's moving towards a technocracy, even if it's a rival. But as soon as that rival is doing, promoting their culture, promoting their people, making nationalistic decisions, then they're upset about it.
Right. I mean, you have to understand it's a feature. A technocracy or a technocratic society is at odds with, religion or, whatever. So it's part of the deal that, there's a reason why, liberals used to be so about, China until Xi Jinping. There's a reason why these liberals used to literally betray the United States of America during the Cold War, and then they switched camps because, first of all, conservatives tend to be very stupid. They think that we were fighting the Russians during the Cold War, when in reality we were fighting communists, because we were friends during the Civil War. The Russian Navy protected American harbors. John Paul Jones, after the Revolutionary War, went to fight for the Russian Tsar. I mean, if you go even further, during the Bolshevik Revolution, we sent a division of men, 10,000 men, on an expeditionary force to Siberia to help interdict and fight the communists. We have always been anti-communists, and that's the thing, is that these conservatives need to wrap their stupid head around, their little cow-like brain around, is the fact that we're not against Russians. We're against communists, and communists are not in Russia anymore. They're here. They're making the decisions. They're on YouTube, and they're telling you what to think. Start thinking for yourself. And I'm glad that you went into all this detail. I really do appreciate it. And I think I'm gonna have to invite you for another segment about the PRC, which is the People's Republic of China, here soon. Would you be down for that, War Chief?
Yes, I'd be down, because there's a lot to unpack there. Because again, we had to address Russia first, because the rhetoric that Zeihan had on that podcast was just astronomical rhetoric. And then he kind of gives a more the rhetoric is a little bit less, but it's still pretty bad when he starts talking about China. So yeah, we definitely got to get in there and unpack that. I'm definitely down for another episode.
Perfect. Thank you so much for coming on. This is General Lance. This is the War Room, signing off.